Welcome back, everybody. Event is almost wrapped. We've only got a couple more sessions to go. I hope that you're enjoying this kind of today, a little bit more on the development side. I know Doug's session that just took place. Wow, that was pretty incredible. My head is still spinning from that one, and I'm sure that Chrisanna is going to do something similar for this session now that's coming up. Beginner's Guide to Inclusion and Accessibility. I know Chrisanna, you've presented with TLDC in the past. I think we were just did the eLearning Tools Summit where you gave us a great recording of your presentation that people can find on the resource page there. And then now we have you for this one, and I'm really looking forward to it. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hide myself and let you get started.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lewis, and hello, TLDC. My preferred name is Chris. I am a white female in my early 50s ish. I wear glasses and have graying blonde hair. My pronouns are she and her. Now, these topics are very important to me for several reasons. In elementary school, I was diagnosed with dyslexia, and I love that it is okay to talk about it because I did not feel comfortable disclosing it for a lot of my life. Anyway, in fifth grade, my teachers actually told my mom that my chances of graduating high school were small due to my needs getting lost in our very large city school district. And so we moved. She packed us up and we moved to a suburban school district where I was able to get the assistance I needed to graduate. I also have a unilateral hearing loss, which basically means loss of hearing in one ear. I had my first eye surgery around 3, which is also when I started wearing glasses, and I grew up with an aunt and grandfather who are blind, so accessibility is very near and dear to me. Now, I am in rural Oklahoma, just up the road from Kayleen, and the digital divide or lack of broadband internet is alive and well, so I may turn off my camera. I know our last session we had some issues, but hopefully we can go through this without any problems whatsoever. Now, the surge in popularity of the terms when we think about inclusive and accessibility really seems to result in the blurring of some boundaries and the confusion around what each of them means with the terms, again, they're using interchangeably. So today we're going to talk about what accessibility and inclusion are and why designing learning for everyone really is becoming a requirement at most organizations. So yay for that. Some simple strategies you can do to make inclusion and accessible easier, along with reviewing some tools and checklists to properly vet your learning programs. And I actually have 2 ebooks that I will be sharing URLs to at the end of the session. I would also encourage everyone to listen to the other sessions, but I loved one of the comments that came up during yesterday's accessibility FAQ panel. And the question was, why do we have to wait to design for accessibility and inclusivity until we're asked for it? And I'm going to say we don't. I have many customers. I've been doing this for a long time. I have a Fortune 100 customer that does exactly what Diane and some of the others said when we talk about accessibility. Oh, no, we don't have anyone that has those needs. And I just cringe. And little do they know, their courses that they've got through me at least go to level A. Not quite there for level AA, but I've got it to where when I have to tweak it for them, I'm ready to jump in at no problem, and we'll get there. And that's something that we're going to talk about. So when we think about what is a disability, this is defined as a CDC, and I'm not going to read it to you. But the spectrum of disabilities is really quite broad and diverse when it comes to accessibility considerations. But we could kind of categorize them as people with permanent disabilities. And again, that's where we usually use the term disability with them. Disabilities due to age. And again, everybody is vulnerable here. And again, those situational disabilities, which is where I've kind of been doing that backdoor convincing some clients. They say they may not have a need, but I'm like, what about these situational? And we'll talk quite a bit about those. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but for accessibility concerns, the structures and containers that really hold your information, the channels that carry your information, and the way that your information is formatted is governed who basically we use the guidelines through the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, and they develop other standards too, such as HTML, CSS, and they're the ones that created the WCAG or WCAG guidelines, and these really are global guidelines followed around the world. Now, when we think of e-learning, if you're not familiar with this, hopefully you are, but within training and development, Section 508 is the set of those 50 guidelines we reference based on WCAG. And I like to differentiate between everything. So again, we're speaking the same language, because I still hear people also say, well, I need to develop an ADA compliant course. And I'm like, well, ADA is the physical structure, but I know what you're talking about, and let's go and we'll work with that. Um, so thank you for sharing that. WCAG further 2.0, and we'll talk about the future of WCAG this afternoon, takes those guidelines basically into 3 levels of conformance: A, AA, and AAA. And one of the things that was mentioned, again, during the conversations, during several people's presentations too, is you can't think that you understand all your audience. You really need to do an audience analysis that will help you decide the level that you need to do, and then you can develop your content to meet that level and those particular needs. Basically, your level A is your minimum standard. That's primarily for those visual and hearing limitations. It basically enables screen readers. It's a start. This definitely falls short of the current best practices and standards. Our double A would be, it means, of course, the A, and this is that good, happy medium that most people go for. And of course, triple A would be the highest, and this is the level that I often have to do for where I teach at my local community college. And this is where, again, I may have someone who signs along with me presenting. Now, when we think about these things, we think about, of course, visual. So we always make assumption, well, it's blindness, but it could also be low vision, farsightedness, nearsightedness, astigmatism, glaucoma, or what about a distracted student taking your class? So you may need to make sure you have those visuals. When we think about hearing, we primarily think of deafness and hard of hearing, but what about things such as temporarily or partial hearing loss, an ear infection, or again, maybe they're taking some just in time training or micro learning in a noisy environment, like a bartender or someone working at an airport. Okay, so these are ways you can convince people that you need to be accessible. When we think about motor, again, this references physical impairments, and as e learning developers, we also need to think about their dexterity. The mouse, the keyboard, touchpad, is a lot of people again make those assumptions thinking it's a loss or damage of limbs, but it could also be arthritis, paralysis, multiple sclerosis, or what about those situational cases of an arm or hand injury? Okay. And then, of course, our cognitive, which would be those learning difficulties such as Down syndromes, neurodiverse conditions such as dyslexia or ADHD, could be psychological, memory loss, reduced attention span, mental health problems like anxiety or depression. And it could be, again, that loss of memory or limited problem solving. There's so many things and so many ways we can help so many people just by incorporating this into our training. Now, again, I mentioned those situational. I want us to really think of, and this is a way I've been able to convince many of my clients who aren't required to do it, to think about those age related, situational, or temporary impairments. Someone medical with a restricted endurance, attention, or mobility. They had an accident. They may have broken their arm, hearing or vision loss. But what happens when your IT specialist breaks their right arm and they're right handed? Or they're a weekend warrior, again, they worked in the yard all weekend and they sprained their wrist. What do you do? Well, years ago, we would send them to catch up on training and they would sit in a classroom for weeks. Can't really do that now because now all of our classes are online, but they can't use their mouse and the classes are not keyboard accessible. So, what are they going to do? So, these are ways that you can hopefully help them to see it really is beneficial for everyone. Excuse me. In 2008, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on here. I just want to give just kind of an overview. The guidelines were upgraded to 2.1, which took those initial 14 guidelines and put them into 4 principles, often referred to as POUR, for perceivable. And perceivable really just means that the user needs to be able to take in the content. They need to see the content or hear it. It cannot be invisible to all their senses. It needs to be operational. This means that they need to be able to do what they need to do on the computer. Okay, again, by using a keyboard or voice only, it's not relying on the mouse. It needs to be understandable. And this is the reason I really hit on this topic, because this means that users must be able to fully comprehend the content. Clear and simple language. The content or operation we need to make sure it doesn't go above their cognitive ability to understand. An example would be if the navigation actions are consistent and predictable, they become easier to understand. The learner knows by selecting a certain icon or button that that specific result will occur. And this is something on LinkedIn and Facebook and all these groups. A lot of people are like, oh, we're tired of this. We need to make it fun. We need to do all these other things. It's like, okay, but it has to be understandable too. My undergrad is in journalism, and one thing they taught us back then was to write at an eighth grade level. Now, many places are now saying write at a sixth grade level. And before people get upset, please note this does not mean that people cannot read or comprehend at a higher level. It's just that even those who, I mean, some people can, some people can't, but even those who can, our brains are amazing computers and we process all kinds of information. So if we write, though, at that level, it means that we can read and speed read things, and it makes it quicker for comprehension and understanding. Now, there's some websites you can use for this. There is, excuse my pronunciation here, but that's Grammarly, if I'm saying that correctly. It is an online browser extension that you can add. But MS Word, Outlook, those will also give you reading grade level reports with tips. So that's kind of something maybe to keep in mind. Last but not least is the poor or the perceivable. And this really just means that, and you'll notice it's kind of framed a little differently if you're a visual, if you can see it there. And basically, this just means that as the technology and the devices evolve, content should remain available to users in all the different types of assistive technology. And that's one of the reasons my preference for when I'm building accessible content is in Lectora, because that is really one of their main focuses. So now, inclusivity, what is that? Well, to use a physical analogy, let's imagine a very old, very traditional, members only gentlemen's club with a grand old clubhouse that is hundreds of years old. Now, let's say that club decided it was time to modernize in order to meet the new accessibility requirements. So they took the time to put in wheelchair ramps, handrails, an elevator, hearing aid induction loops, all this stuff. And after all those alterations, the clubhouse would definitely be more accessible, but has a very traditional club that doesn't allow female members and has a substantial joining fee. Could the club ever be considered an inclusive space? And that would be no. So, what is inclusivity? If you're going to be, and I say this over and over again, and I love that DE&I is really coming to the forefront, but to truly, if you're going to be inclusive, you must be accessible. Accessible design is concerned that everyone, of course, can hear, read, and see your message. Inclusive design also asks you to consider the message itself. It requires a greater level of understanding and empathy because you're putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It is designed not necessarily with the logistics of whether people can use it, but whether they want to use it and ultimately whether they feel safe using it. Now, what do we need to do about all of this? Well, by creating these inclusive practices, again, it's more than offering annual diversity training and hoping it makes an impact. And this is stuff where we can do just kind of on our own, in my opinion. Now, when it comes to designing for inclusivity and diversity, my first and most important point is that as a white cis female designer in an industry already dominated by many white cis designers, if you fit that description, the advice I want to offer you is to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Okay. Verna Myers is an amazing diversity and inclusion advocate. And in her top rated TED Talk, she talks about if you want to overcome your biases, you must walk boldly towards them. And my favorite quote of hers, though, is diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is actually being asked to dance. Embrace that change. Immerse yourself in diversity with teams that include people from all ages, genders, sexualities, from all different backgrounds, cultures, and countries. And I promise you, just the ideas that are going to flow and the effect that you're going to have on your end users is going to be amazing. Now, so what are some things that we can do to make these steps? Well, the first thing that you need to do is identify and remove bias in your writing. Now, the general idea is to remove as much bias as possible, including unconscious bias. Now, I want to let you know that though bias is natural, that brain is an amazing computer, but unconscious bias can be overcome. The human brain is flooded with information about the world we live in. And when we're presented with all of this information, the brain creates shortcuts. So if we are, especially as instructors and developers and so forth, if we are to develop things, we need to be aware of our own biases and counter those stereotypes. then we can reduce the strength and the effect of unconscious bias. We also need to make sure that we focus again on that bias-free inclusive language. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. So talk to people about bias. And one of the things when I get new clients, I ask them, what is their business like? What are their company organizations demographics? Do they have an equal split of men and women? Are they LGBTQIA plus inclusive? Do they employ impaired and or disabled individuals? Where are they located? I know many times, especially my students who may not have traveled much, and I hear it even from adults, we think of, oh, everything's here in the US. No, the US is just one country. There are many different views and many different outlooks and many places that are much further ahead than we are. And that may help us in our decision making and help guide us. So these are all things, again, to keep in mind when planning, developing, and designing training. Now, we are reading, seeing, and hearing about this in the news a lot lately that visually, let me get my up there, visually representing diversity matters. Now, people realize, and this is supported by all kinds of research, that the media influences not only how others view them, but how we see ourselves. So, adding diversity to a course may seem simple enough, but we really do need to avoid the trap of just adding a photo of some individuals with different skin tones and thinking, yay, we've accomplished inclusion, because you haven't. When selecting your visual images, you need to be aware of the situations and the positions you put them in. Is every manager portrayed by a white man? Are the roles played by any of those in the visuals? What are their roles? Are any of them token characters? Are all women subordinate? Are all factory workers minorities? What is the dress like? Is the dress gender based with all the women in short skirts? Now, I will say I chose this woman here. I don't consider a short skirt, but with a skirt, because I love the fact that it showed her prosthetic leg. Um, are there and should there be people with religious or cultural headgear or other clothing? And I definitely say yes. And this is one of those that I have over the years been including this stuff in my training, whether I'm developing in Beyond, which he mentioned earlier, or developing Lectora classes. And only twice, and this actually happened within the last year, did someone say, oh, yeah, that person's, and their statement was, that person's a little too diverse. Can you switch that person out? I did, and they are no longer a client of mine, because I'm like, I'm not going to work with them anymore. Now, I'll answer a question here that just came through. We also want to, again, make sure we're doing that all things ethnicity, race, size, ability, social, economic, and gender needs to be included. We need to be aware that this is also evolving. For a long time, the puzzle piece was a piece of a symbol for autism, and this actually started back in the UK in 63. But for recent studies, they've actually shown that it evokes a lot of negativity. And yeah, Kayleen brought that up earlier, and I was like, I'm mentioning that, yay! Um, and so they've kind of moved to the rainbow-colored infinity symbol. This is popular because it symbolizes a broad and varied spectrum of experiences and doesn't evoke any negative connotation. So again, it's evolving. Now, I mentioned I've been in HR and training for a while. I actually started officially in the field in 1998, and in 2000 taught my first course via distance learning, which was our old terminology. And in the past, it was really challenging to find stock photography, and I've seen some notes come up here that were either appropriately reflected minority, ethnic, societal groups, that also weren't blatant stereotypes or disrespectful. Thankfully, that has evolved over the years. We now have access to training specific image repositories. What you're seeing through most of mine is through the I got to get their term right. They changed their name. eLearning Stock Library, which is formerly known as eLearning Brothers, and they contain a ton. And that's actually where this character list that you see below the image from the lower left shows, where it shows you can have a choice in category, which shows like business, casual, sports, hands. Then there's ethnicity, showing the different ethnicities in addition to age. And again, I want to add another link on here. This is some more photos that you might be able to find. Some black and brown photos, nappy.co. They also include some gender spectrum, or gender spectrum, to use genderphotos.vice.com, bodyliberationphotos.com. And I did a session last week, and I actually wrote .com when it should be .co, but tonl.co is another site. Some of these are paid, some of these are free. I know with my Lectora license, I get the full library with eLearning Brothers, ELB Learning. I get it included in my license. And some of these, there's a certain number you can get. So I really encourage you guys to take a look and see what you can do to include this. Some other inclusive practices that a lot of times we don't necessarily think of is using our voice. When designing diverse and inclusive e-learning, we can increase the variety of the vocal talent by ethnic group, age, gender, dialect, and of course, sound. When selecting voices, though, again, return to that discussion of diversity within the company. What characters or narrators do they need to include in their project? Do they have talent that sounds right? And a lot of people are like, oh no, I couldn't do a voiceover. If you're searching for internal, if you can source local internal talent, one of the questions I would ask them, well, have you ever sang? Did you sing in your high school choir, your church choir? Do you sing somewhat professionally? Even possibly if they sing on a karaoke a lot. People who sing, from my experience, seem to know when to pause and when to breathe, and it doesn't come across in the recording aspects as much, so you don't need as much editing. If your current talent pool does not reflect the sound you're looking for, there's many text-to-speech options. But I actually did a search, and there's what my image is on the lower right-hand corner, and I used it through an online audio website called Voice123. I filtered by gender and age, so you can post requests on audio talent. So here what I did was I searched for a female with a Southern accent. I actually found 79 results, but I do want to caution you guys too, when doing requests such as this, make sure you're not looking for a cartoon or overly exaggerated Southern accent. Fake accents are at best counterfeit and at worst quite insulting. So authentic voices, though, however, really resonate power through every aspect of your organization. Now, what are some inclusive practices that we can actually do? Well, the first thing is inclusive language acknowledges diversity and conveys respect to all people. But I want to, as we just kind of looked at momentarily, remember that language and artwork, these thoughts, it is very fluid. So meanings and connotations of words can change. It is more important to apply inclusive language principles than always learning the specific appropriate phrases, because again, it may change, and you need to just be aware of that. It does change, and great. The first thing is people first. I am not an asthmatic woman or a dyslexic woman. I am a woman with asthma and dyslexia. So now, that being said, be aware this is an evolving topic. There is a growing movement within the autistic community, and I just learned this last week, that they want to reclaim the term autistic, because using first language when describing themselves is that if they say a person with autism, there could be that sense that autism is something that can be cured or removed from the person. So again, not everyone does this. It's growing in usage and preference. So again, understand who your audience is and what their needs are. The other would be pronouns. Now, you may recall from the beginning how I introduced myself with my pronouns. I am X, my pronouns are she, her. Lead by example when you introduce yourself, but please don't necessarily require everyone to share your pronouns. Maybe say you can share your pronouns if you want. This takes the pressure off people who are not out from having to answer. If you must ask about pronouns, though, and I really like this artwork except for one thing. I was going to say, if you really don't necessarily do it around other people. As I mentioned, I like this artwork except that word preferred. I want to caution people on their phrases that they really may think are inclusive, but aren't. And a couple of those phrases would be sexual preference. It isn't a preference. Or preferred pronouns. It's not preferred. It's their pronouns. So, yeah, this is pretty good artwork except for that little term there. We also maybe want to go with gender neutral terms, staff members, employees, everyone, teams, and so forth. I've used guys for years because I always figured it was, pretty gender neutral, but a lot of people don't look at it that way. So I'm trying to get that out of my vocabulary. The same is true with terms like, well, we need someone to volunteer to man the booth. Well, how about staff the booth or hosting the booth? So let's try to be gender neutral there. Let's also be careful about family assumptions. Instead of making those assumptions about relationships or biological parents, assuming that there is a mom and or a dad, use spouse or partner, significant other, guardian, parent, caregiver, grown-up, responsible adult. I really don't I have to hope our intention, especially as instructors and developers, we don't want to exclude people. So let's just do what we can to make people feel more included. Growing up without a father, when they did things for Dad's Day and different things, I would volunteer to work and I would just step out because it hurt. And I know that people weren't meaning to include it, but times were different. Also, be careful about phrases. Be careful about those idioms, things like, again, man on the moon. Those can be adaptable to humankind. Be careful about your slang. It's raining cats and dogs. Or I know when I was a teen, we used to say, wow, that is awfully good. Okay, well, is that awful or is that good? Some of these things may need to be explained to international staff members or visitors or anyone, again, who identifies with being on that neurodivergent spectrum, such as autism. Now, I used to actually separate Asperger's from autism, but Asperger's has been dropped, it came to my attention, from the DSM 5. Which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and is now known again as autism. There are many people who will continue to use the word Asperger's to describe themselves. So, again, just be aware of what their preferences are. And one of the ones, especially as I'm becoming more seasoned, is these stereotypes. Use factual language rather than value laden words. My students will say stuff like this all the time. Well, these old drivers are a liability. Okay, I see what you're trying to say, but a better way to phrase that would be as we get older, sight loss is more common, and a result, driving could become more difficult. Now, ask in advance, basically, is what we're saying here. If you're not sure of something, it's fine not to know something, but know where to go to find out and get reputable answers. Diane Elkin said yesterday, try, and I love this. As you go on this journey, there are going to be people that criticize your choices about not being enough or not accurate. Those of us that are presenting and making changes, I'm kudos to everyone in this organization, but we're going to put our foot in our mouth and we're going to say something inappropriate. But I encourage you to do it anyway, because if we don't talk about it, we won't make it better. Now, also be okay though when someone points out something that you did or you didn't do, because it's your own learning opportunity. I'm seeing lots of comments come in. Thank you. I will try to read and look. My attention span isn't that great. So the exclusive language samples, I'm not going to go through all of this, but again, we focus on that bias-free. The biggest one that I hear so many people aren't aware of is things like grandfathering and grandfather clause. We've got to use a different term. This originally, of course, a lot of times they think of it with their unlimited data plan. The term actually came about in the American South in the 1890s as a way to defy the 15th Amendment. So an alternative to this would be to use the word legacy. Some other terms, which I think you can probably kind of figure out, would be gypped in any variation. Ghetto, again, this started with the Nazis, but a lot of people use it to associate with poor areas and non-white residents. I know it makes me cringe when I hear that. Handicap is another term. And some disability advocates believe this term is rooted in that correlation between disabled individual and a beggar who had to beg with a cap in their hand. So that first person language would be person with disability, populations with disability, whatever that terminology may be. Handicap parking, someone asked in a previous session, well, what do they call it now? A lot of times they call it accessible parking. And again, in my ebook that I'll be giving you guys, I actually have more samples of this. I was trying to get this down to a shorter time frame. I worked for a Native American tribe for, 8 years. The Indian or American Indian, again, maybe use Native American, Indigenous, First People. It kind of really depends on where you are in the world as to what the correct terminology is, but don't name them based on Anglo-Saxon perceptions. Lame, again, I hear my tween nieces and nephews use this to think about, oh, they're using it to just thinking of, oh, that something is lame. But again, it really is an ableist term. Master slave is something I really want to. This is used a lot in the IT world to think of that one machine. Now they're going to replica or primary or standby. We're actually even seeing the master bedroom term in real estate being now called the primary bedroom and primary bath. And several people on there, yes, Jude, and Jewing, trying to get that best price. Along with peanut gallery. These are all terminologies that, again, are mentioned in the book that I would really strongly encourage you guys just not to use and find alternatives. So how do we design accessible e-learning? Well, it's really up to you to ensure you're designing your content for as many people as possible, including those with those visual, hearing, motor, cognitive limitations or disabilities. The most important thing as a developer, though, that we can do is design with accessibility in mind. Knowing how to use the tools in your toolbox will be essential to your success. And we saw that in the previous session. Understanding how your software works. I personally find Lectora to be not only the very powerful authoring tool, I find it the easiest to create fully accessible courses. And I do own licenses to, well, my Captivate license is a little old, but I'm getting ready to try the new one. But I also do have a very active license with my Articulate products. But again, if I'm building accessibility, I'm going to go with Lectora, or I usually decline the work. It takes too much time and too much extra work. So one of the first things that you can do is, again, your authoring tool should include certain features that make creating accessible content easier and more intuitive. In this example, we see the Lectora use web accessibility settings, and you can turn that on. As soon as you do, it's going to do things like adjust your language. So basically, it lets the screen reader know that a specific text block may be different than default text, especially obviously if you have multiple text languages in your courses. It's going to set your alt tags to initially empty. Okay, so you're not going to have those accidents. It's going to make sure that video and audio skins are disabled, that rollover video controls are disabled, that always on top property for objects is not selected by default. And that is huge, which again, we kind of saw in the previous session. It is also going to give you the ability to adjust your visual indicators by displaying again when that object received focus. Again, we just saw that in the previous session. And last but not least, it will set your reading order to last, which is a feature will enable you to do. So these are all things we just saw. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them, but that's what happens with them. So one of the things I would also encourage you guys doing is use your accessibility checker. Anytime during the process of designing or developing a project, you can do this. And what it's going to do is look for items that you may have problems. Now, keep in mind, this tool should not be used as a final indicator in determining whether or not your project is WCAG compliant. There is no automated tool that can fully accomplish what a person can do with a manual test. I promise you that. I've done the research. I do it all the time with this. It's just not there. An example for what the accessibility checker can do, though, is it can't determine if you have appropriately provided synchronized captions for animations or videos within your project, but it can detect that you have animations and videos and gives you a reminder letting you know that you need to address the animation or video and make sure you have that alt tag set up. Some best practices I would encourage you guys, even if you're not creating accessible content now, I would encourage you to follow these best practices. And part of it is naming an order. Items are named where not only you can identify them, because how often have you had to go back to a course a week, a month, a year later, and you don't remember what things were or where things are, or maybe someone in your department has, but go ahead and name those items as they should be. The naming can also be automatically used for alt text, which at least in Lectora. Also go ahead and place them in a keyboard-friendly tabbing order, which again works for that screen reader order. With your photos, select empty alt tags for decorative images, those images that do not add information. So I could select that. The last thing you want to do, though, is take out the name. Do not leave the object name blank, because screen readers will often then end up reading the image's file name. So in this example here, instead of saying Section 508 compliance, and that should say logo, it would say 11020 JPEG. That means nothing to anyone. Okay, so be very aware of these things, and they're easy things to do. Also, be careful about your always on top. Okay, because again, that deals with that property for an object. It places that object at the topmost layer of the page, and at the same time makes it the object first identified by a screen reader, or again, their tabbing order. Now, I'm not going to go into this a whole lot. I do encourage you guys to, again, listen to Dr. Bello Saprina. Saprina. I can't, the name, sorry about that. His session from yesterday was amazing. Two popular assistive technologies, and I just wanted to show kind of the logo so you can kind of recognize it, is the purple logo, purple square with the white N inside is your NVDA, which is your non-visual desktop access. The cute little smiling shark with JAWS underneath it is the JAWS, which stands for Job Access with Speech. They are assistive technologies, but there are many of them out there. And again, listen to his session. It was great. Now, as I said, I personally own license to Captivate, Storyline, Rise, Lectora, but when I'm building accessible, I find Lectora to be much easier. But whenever tool you're using, you really need to understand how it works with the screen reader and how it works with the tabbing order. In some tools or online projects, you have to indicate what the individual objects are. And I saw some people, I think, talk about it in the wrap up yesterday. So you'll see people, and we'll see that where it says D3 Training Solutions, that is the icon for an image, but they'll actually add the word button or image to buttons or image. You don't need to. Well, I say you don't need to. Know your software. It depends on your software. I know with Lectora, I don't need to at all. The screen reader automatically recognizes, oh, that's an image. So it will say D3 Training Solutions, Design, Develop, Deliver, logo, image or image of, okay, or button, okay, if I'm talking about where I don't have a button on this page, the next button, I wouldn't need to put it on there because you don't want them to hear button, button, and that would just get very annoying. Again, when it comes to screen readers, we saw this in the last session. Think about your layering. It identifies items from top to bottom. So in this particular case, it would start with image of busy highway at sunset. Here, I like to put, if I've changed it to empty alt, I like to put an underscore empty alt next to it because that tells me that I know I've checked it as empty alt. And when I go back to look at it a week, a month, a year later, or someone else does, they're like, oh, she already checked and made sure all of her alt tags need to be there or not. Then it would say hands on steering wheel image or image of. And then it knows when there's a text, it would actually read the text item, which is what I really said right there. Again, with putting the words button next to, so instead of saying next button, it would just say, or if I would put the word button there, it would say next button button. That would get annoying. It automatically reads content within a text block. And of course, skip navigation is essential because you don't want it reading your headings and reading, in this case, the project name, the home button, the help button, the exit button. You wouldn't necessarily want it reading to each one. And I know it was mentioned in the last section, and he talked about your heading levels. The technical term for this, maybe I didn't put it on there, is your HTML. And HTML defines 6 levels of heading, H1 through H6. And those headings communicate the organization of the content to the browser. And that's kind of the default of how those web browsers, the plugins, assistive technology, they actually use those. The most important heading has the rank of H1. And so I usually put my title in all of, we can see on here, page title. And then I've got the note on there that it is an H1, again, just to let myself know, let others know if they're ever looking at the coding behind the scenes that I've already set that up. When we think about accessible, all I really want to think of here when we're thinking about a keyboard is, as a developer, put your mouse aside, go test your course, and just use your keyboard to navigate around it, because normally this means they're using the tab key, the shift, plus tab. They may also use your space bar, arrows, alt, page up, page down. They're using those particular buttons. Again, the same is kind of true with the other. Within Lectora, it's all, you don't have to click and go to another space. It's all in that project or that title explorer. Whatever order I put things in is going to be the order that the screen reader is going to read it and the order that the keyboard navigation is going to read. So I don't have to open up any additional windows or anything. You can, though, set up to where your back and your next is read as last, and kind of that same focus that we mentioned earlier. So my favorite advice as we wrap this up for you all would be to create a style guide. They were originally created to make that consistent look and feel for a business, but it can be extremely helpful to ensure that you're creating things accurately to the standards and requirements of your LMS and for accessibility. I encourage you to reach out to your marketing department to see what their style guide looks like, and you can tweak it from there. 2 of my favorite features and major time savers would be, again, create templates. Create a template for kind of the bones of the accessibility bones that you need it to be. One thing that Lectora has that I haven't found in any other software is a library object. If there's things I want to reuse in other software, I have to go and think, what class was that in? Let me open it up, let me copy, and then I paste it. Well, with Lectora, I can actually create library objects, and I have hundreds of them. And I can create it, and that can be a single object, a text, a page, icons. It can be a set of objects. It can actually be an entire chapter, section, page. I've actually got interactions that I've already built for one client on how do you do a drag and drop, but make it look like a drag and drop, but still be accessible. I'm saving all that coding, and I'll save it again as a library object, so I have access to it anytime I want. Some additional help, Lectora actually, and I invite you all to join the Lectora Accessibility User Group. It was established by a dear friend of mine, Christine O'Malley, in May of 2017, and we meet once a month. It is free for January through October from 10 to 11:30 a.m. Central Time on the last Thursday of each month. Accessibility is so important that eLearning actually sends 2 of their developers to our sessions each month to ensure Lectora is meeting the needs of the accessibility community. You may also sign up for training. There's all kinds of training. I know IAC offers some training on specifically developing in accessibility. They also offer a session, and you'd hear my voice, I'm the one that usually does it, of getting started with Lectora, and I develop a course within 1 hour for you guys. But there's also, again, just like many of the others, there's the Rockstar community, but the LAUG group, which is that Lectora Accessibility User Group, we are also on there, and that's another way that we can continue to communicate. I mentioned the 2 books. I would like to give you all access to 2 books I've co-authored, Making eLearning Accessible, which again I co-authored with Christine O'Malley, and How Accessibility is Changing, Why It Matters, and What You Can Do, that I co-authored with the Brandon Hall Group. You can download those for step-by-step guidance in making e-learning accessible. There's WCAG checklists, problem-solving strategies that you can really use for any authoring tool. And I also went ahead and thought I'd add the QR codes for there if that is a little bit easier. So the biggest thing I'd want you to leave with is people with disabilities are the largest minority in the world, and it is the only minority group we can join at any time. So while you may not be required by law to create inclusive and accessible training, I would really hope you'll start to be proactive. Obviously, you are by being here, and look at accessibility through the lens of universal design, ensuring you're delivering a quality product that is accessible to all your learners. I would also like to make a big shout out to thank Max Evans, and I don't know if he is on the call, and Gwen Clapperich, I don't know if I'm saying the last name right, they've each taken, they've done kind of what Diane said, they have each taken the time to provide some amazing insights to previous versions of the sessions. They reached out to me via LinkedIn, and I love it because that really does just help us all. So, whew, okay. And that was my session cut down. Questions, let's see. Do I have resource photos, clip art that you use when looking for diverse? Free preferred. It really depends. Again, I look at, thank you. Oh, cool. I get mine free through eLearning. I know Storyline has, they have, what they've done, they're not actually, those, you could actually find any of the images within Articulate product on the web. They're actually already free, common, but they have gathered them all together in one spot to make it easier. But several of those sites that I added, and I didn't put the link on here, but I think someone may have put it into the chat. Several of those offer, you can get 1 or 2 images free, or they're relatively inexpensive. So,
Yeah, and I did see that there were, I think, at least one recommendation that I saw in chat during when you were talking, Chrisana. So we probably have to back up to look for it, but I do believe that there were some postings
yes,
with some
here
links.
it is. I'm going to copy this down here. And I have a resource and a blog, and I will share it out to the group, or I'm not even sure where I wrote it last, and it probably needs to be updated on some places to go for images. And I didn't have disabilityimages.com, so thank you for that.
Sure, and there, yeah, Kayleen's posting some resources. Awesome. And just a reminder, I did create a Slack channel for this group. Let me post the link in again real quick, just in case you missed it from the last session. But we can continue the conversation there, and also the AIDC is going to turn into a resource page all together with, we'll be updating content there regularly. I've already been talking to Chrisanna about that. I know I've spoken to Alan and Kayleen, I believe. So, the event website, just bookmark that and keep an eye out. I'll announce when it's ready. It's just going to take me a little bit of time. And with that, let's see, Chrisanna, do you have anything else?
That's it. I tried to whittle it down for you.
Thank you so much. That was great. A lot. It's just amazing stuff. We actually probably should have opened with you today. So that was great. Let's
I do want to
see.
say thanks to Kayleen, again, my neighbor here in Oklahoma, at least, but for adding all the links and chats in there. Greatly appreciated.
Yes. And then let's see, I think I'm seeing people are having problems accessing the Slack channel. I know that if you go to tldchat.us, that also takes you to the Slack channel, and then you're just going to have to join the AIDC channel itself to get in there. So, Andy, will replays be available indefinitely? Not through AirMeet. Once we wrap up here, it's going to take me a week or so to format all the recordings and get them onto a resource page, but I'll send that out to everybody that's registered for this event. And then they'll also be on the tldc.com website. You'll be able to access them there. So that's it. Okay. Thanks again, Chrisanna. Thank you so much for doing this again. And we'll see everybody in the panel coming up in about 10 minutes or so. Bye, everyone.